Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about women cotton mill workers in particular. And I have to say, this is slightly outside my sort of focus, which is more on transatlantic enslavement and landscapes and plantations and landed estates. But I've been doing some work on the slavery connections of the cotton industry for a few years now. But I've learned a lot by just doing the research for this talk, so it's really been really interesting. So what I want to talk to you about today is about some of the background about cotton mill workers, and then focus on the experiences of women and girls in the mills in particular. So I don't know how much you know about the history of the factory system and this area's connection with that, but I guess most of you will have heard of Richard Arkwright and yes, his factory at Cromford, and the creation of this new style of working, the factory system. And that development wasn't just a new style of technology. What it did was create a new type of worker as well. So that was the aim at that time, to really create a worker who would work in that context of the factory. And women were incredibly important workers in that new factory system, women and girls, so children more broadly, but females in particular. And I think it's quite interesting to think about, well, what was it like as a textile worker before the factory system, just to get a sense of what the factory system did to people who worked in the textile industry. So women would have undertaken certain activities in textile working. They were typically spinners, okay? So they were spinners of yarns in the home. So that was something they could fit within their domestic routine and within other activities like agricultural activities or other sort of small-scale industries. So they could fit that spinning work around those other activities. But once you went into a factory, you were working a shift. You had to just focus on the activities in the factory. And most of the women who went into the factories went in as children, okay? And some went in as children of large families who were attracted to come to work in the cotton mills. And some went in as so-called apprentices. I don't know if you've come across the apprentice system. They were poor, typically poor children from the south and east, where there was less employment opportunities. Some of them had no parents, but many of them did have parents, but they were taken into workhouses, and then manufacturers who were looking for workers would advertise for them and take apprentices into their factories. And child apprentices were not paid, but other child workers were paid. So thinking about what I spoke about in terms of enslaved labour, these are children, they're at work, some of them from very young ages, sort of 5 or 6 in some cases, but that was something that went on in agricultural work, in mining and so on at the time. But those children, if they were just ordinary child workers, they would get paid money for doing that. It's the apprentices who didn't get paid. They would sign up for a period of time where they would learn the skills within the system, and that at the end of that time they would become waged labourers. And I think it was typically 7 years apprenticeship.
7 years?
They were, it sounds awful, they were given board and lodging. So if you think they've come out of a workhouse system, where they would be working in a workhouse, that was, you know, if you were supported by the parish, if your family became impoverished, you had to, after 1795, go into a workhouse, and you were expected to do work or to be hired out by the workhouse. And so it's akin to what would have happened, I think, in the workhouse context. So yeah, these are unfree labourers, but they are quite different in status to the enslaved people of African descent we were speaking about last week. So why were industrialists interested in women and children? Well, there are a number of reasons. If you think about children in particular, they were coming into a system of labour that was new to them. So they hadn't got that legacy of having more independence, of working in different ways. So they were like being trained up to this new factory system. They were being trained up to do monotonous work, to do repetitive work. They were thought to be more docile than adult men in particular, and women also were felt to be more docile, used to discipline, and just more amenable. So girls and women were felt to be workers who would object less to the authority in the mill. They were thought to not be so inclined to run away, or to abscond in other ways, or object to the working conditions. So, you know, whether we believe this or not, you know, that was the idea, that women and girls would be easier to manage, easier to train. And there's actually some evidence that some of the new forms of technology were actually designed for smaller bodies, for children, and maybe for smaller women as well. So taking a local example from Cromford, Richard Arkwright's mill, in 1789, at that time, they were employing, I think in 2 or 3 mills, 1,150 workers, and only 150 of those were men. The rest were women and children. And he actually put out adverts in the local newspaper for large families. So he wanted families to come to the area, and he built housing for some of those families, and the men would work as weavers in the weavers' rooms at the top of the cottages with those weavers' windows. I don't know whether you've seen those, to allow the light to come in for weaving. And then the women and children would work in the factory. I mean, there were some men who worked in the factories. They tended to be doing more jobs like carpentry or managing the actual mechanics of the machines. So I'm talking here in the early factories, it was cotton spinning, and in the Arkwright system they used something called a water frame, and this was said to make a noise like a thrush. Again, I don't know whether I believe it or not. So they were sometimes called throstles, the water frame. But the new factories. Has anyone been to Cromford to see how actually quite small the first factory there was? Quite narrow. It's quite long and narrow with a number of floors. And in those factories, they would pack in as many of these water frames, really as they could fit in. So there's actually very little space for moving around in the factory. So again, perhaps a reason for having smaller people working there. And there's a big debate, but at the time, women and children did tend to get paid less. Certainly children were paid less than adults, and women tended to be paid less than men. Some people debate that, but I think generally that's the feeling. So that's another reason perhaps for having women and children as the workforce, but I don't think it is the only reason. But maybe with this new experimental system, it was less risky to have a cheaper workforce deployed, and then there were all those advantages that I just talked about just the more docile nature of women and children. Okay. So in Nottinghamshire, you had some use of the Arkwright system, so the water frame, but you also had the use of the spinning mule, which was driven by steam. And in those factories, they tended to be hotter. I think all the factories were warm because if you kept the thread warm and damp, it was less likely to snap. So in terms of the conditions of working in the factory, it was cramped, they tended to be quite hot. You had people overseeing your work in a way you wouldn't in the domestic setting. You were told to come in to work a shift, and a shift was typically 12 hours. I think with a lunch break, but 12 hours. And at Cromford, set up in 1771, in I think the 1780s, there was such demand, they were working 24 hours a day with two 12-hour shifts. And in some cases, the child apprentices would come out of the bed and work, and another one would go into the bed after their work. So it could be very, very intensive. I think that the loudness of the spinning machines was particularly the spinning mule was heavier and louder. But then when you got the mechanisation of weaving, you maybe have been to visit cotton mills and have heard the weaving machines in particular. They are very, very noisy. But I think probably noisier than the spinning machines. So people work night shifts. People were standing up. People were in this atmosphere where cotton, pieces of cotton were in the air. So you might have come across this idea of the diseases of the lungs that you got from breathing in the cotton. So that was really these flying fibres caused damage to the eyes and the lungs. So that was something the children and young women in particular suffered from. And there's also some discussion about the ways in which the bodies of children were altered by working in these contexts. So with the children, so they would be trained to understand the whole working of the factory. So they would move around from different tasks and learn about how things, the different stages of the process. So there would be cleaning of the cotton, there would be carding of the cotton, and then there would be spinning. And then in the early factories, the weaving didn't take place in the factories. It was still out in a more domestic setting, and gradually the the weaving came into the factories. Yeah, so what would the children do? Well, they moved around a lot under the machines to pick up fragments of cotton and to rethread machines. So they had to be really quick to avoid crushing their fingers, crushing their hands, and in the most extreme cases, head injuries. And I think that's how a lot of children were killed, being caught by the shuttle going across. But I think there was also damage to girls, to their pelvises by standing in the factories, and some sense as well that children didn't thrive in this hot and sometimes dark sort of context of the factory. And it did depend how well you were fed, did depend on who you worked for as well. So rations were not always good for these children, but some families were given gardens so that they could grow some of their own food themselves if they got the time and the energy to do it. So, like I talked about last week, I think often our histories have been written by white male commentators, and in this context, a lot of the industrial history was written early on by men, and the labour of women in factories has often been cast as unskilled work, but it wasn't unskilled. These were, even the children often came from families that had a familiarity with textiles, with thread, with how you make a thread strong, so which would have helped them when they were working on the spinning machines. And certainly many of the women had that skill. So this wasn't unskilled labour. It was actually, even though in the factory system you tended to, once you'd learnt how everything was produced, you tended to focus on a particular task, and you had to do it quickly and you had to do it efficiently. And that is a real skill, being able to do that. That is not unskilled. In my book, that is not unskilled. So these were skilled people who weren't paid very well, but were very effective at what they did. And this workforce was very young. I mean, even when people came out of the apprenticeship system or when they became adults, it was quite often people under 21 who were the main workers. The majority of the workers were under 21. Okay. So I think there's a change from this earlier period to a bit later on in the 19th century, when you've got the spinning mule taking over from the water frame. You've got the mechanisation of weaving. You've got more men coming in to manage these spinning mules, and it becomes unionised, male-run unions, and you get women moving more into the weaving and managing the weaving sites. And of course, women had to manage all these other things in their lives, as well as actually working in the factories. So many of them would marry, many of them would have children, and many of them would have to manage working in the factory alongside those roles in their own households and as mothers. So women tended to leave the industry a bit earlier than men. So there's been some work on the child workers and how long they stayed in the paid employment. And on average, women stayed in for about 23 years and men for about 35 years. So there is a bit of difference there. But there's also this growing idea of what was an appropriate role for a woman. Was it appropriate to work in a factory alongside men? How much emphasis should be placed on your more domestic role, the idea of the domestic woman? And you see this in some of the education given in the factories to boys and girls, that they were both boys and girls were offered educational opportunities, learning to read and write, but there was some gendered aspect to it, so that the girls were more instructed in terms of domesticity, domestic skills, as well as work skills, and the boys didn't have that domestic sort of orientation. What else have I got to say here? Women did the spinning, but they also, I think this isn't much talked about, they did the cleaning. When the cotton wool arrived in bags or bales, it often arrived, not in a condition to be spun immediately. It had to be carded, but it also needed to be cleaned. And I think women did a lot of that work, the picking and the cleaning of the cotton wool when it came into the factory. Okay, so I think that's my quick overview of what it was like to be a woman worker in this period.